My dad called my fiancé a downgrade, then needed his law firm. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm 33 years old, and for the last 9 years I've worked in brand marketing, the last 4 of them as Director of Brand Strategy at a mid-sized consumer goods company in Charlotte, North Carolina. I mention my job first because it matters later, because the version of me who sat at that engagement dinner in October, holding a champagne glass I never got to drink from, was a woman who had built a stable, competent, unremarkable life. I paid my bills. I kept a spreadsheet of my savings goals for fun. I did not, as a rule, cause scenes. My father caused the scene that night. I just happened to be sitting across from him when he did it. We were at Foglia, the Italian place on South Tryon my mother loves because it reminds her of a restaurant in Florence she and my father went to on their honeymoon, back when he was an ambitious young developer with a briefcase full of blueprints, and she was 24 and certain she'd married a man who was going somewhere. 37 years later, my father had, in fact, gone somewhere. He owned Bennett Development Group, a mid-market commercial real estate firm with its name on 2 office parks and a strip of townhomes off Providence Road, and he had never once let anyone at that table forget it. I had just introduced Daniel Reyes to my extended family as my fiancé. Daniel is a real estate and construction litigation attorney, a founding partner at a 9-person firm called Reyes and Whitmore. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gastonia with a mother who cleaned offices at night and put herself through paralegal school during the day. He is, by every measure that has ever mattered to me, the most solid person I have ever loved. My father lifted his glass to toast us. He got through to Maya and, before he paused, looked at Daniel's suit, which was good but not showy, and said, loud enough for the whole table and 2 of the neighboring ones to hear, "Well, it's not who I pictured for her, but I suppose after Grant, anyone's a step up." He smiled like he'd made a joke. Then, quieter but not quiet enough, still, a downgrade from where she started. Nobody at the table laughed. My mother reached for her water glass. My sister Vanessa looked at her husband. And I sat very still, doing what I had done my whole life when my father said something cruel and dressed it as candor. I did the math on how much it would cost me to react. I didn't know yet that in 14 months, my father would be sitting in a windowless conference room on the 9th floor of a building on South College Street, sliding a manila folder across a table to my fiancé's law partner, asking, not telling, asking for help. I didn't know that the folder in front of me, in a shoebox in the back of my own closet, would end up mattering more than his. But that's getting ahead of things. Let me start where this story actually starts, which is not with the toast and not even with me. Hi, before I go further, if you're new here, welcome. I tell true stories about families, money, and the quiet moments where people decide who they're really going to be. I write these out slowly and carefully because I think these stories deserve care, and because I think a lot of you have lived some version of this. If that's you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want to hear where this goes, stick around and subscribe, because this one takes a while to get where it's going, and I promise it's worth the drive. Now, let me take you back. The Bennett Way. I grew up in a house on a cul-de-sac in Myers Park, the kind of neighborhood where the trees are older than the country, and the lawns are cut by services nobody discusses. My father, Richard Bennett, was 40 when I was born, already 10 years into building Bennett Development Group from a single strip mall in Pineville into something that, by the time I was in middle school, had his name on a plaque outside a 6-story office building downtown. My mother, Linda, had been a kindergarten teacher before she married him and never went back to it. Not because he asked her to stop, exactly, but because somewhere in the first 5 years of their marriage, it stopped being a question either of them thought to ask. I was the middle child. My sister Vanessa is 3 years older than me, and my brother Tyler is 4 years younger. If you'd asked any of us, at any point growing up, to describe our family in one sentence, we would have said some version of the same thing. My father built something out of nothing, and the rest of us lived inside it. That sentence sounds neutral. It wasn't. Living inside something somebody built means living by their blueprints. My father had a phrase he used from the time I could understand English. The Bennett Way. The Bennett Way meant excellence. It meant winning. It meant never, under any circumstances, embarrassing the family name in front of people who mattered, and my father had a very specific, very fluid definition of who mattered, which tended to correlate suspiciously well with net worth. The Bennett way also meant something else, something none of us had language for until much later. It meant that love in our house was never separate from performance. You didn't get affection for being. You got it for achieving, and even then, only until the next achievement was due. Vanessa understood this earlier than I did, and she adapted faster. By the time she was 12, she had figured out that my father's approval functioned like a light switch. You could turn it on with the right grades, the right activities, the right friends from the right families, and she got very good at flipping that switch. She ran for student council. She played tennis, a sport my father approved of, rather than soccer, which he did not, for reasons he never fully explained, but which I suspect had to do with which country club families played which sport. She dated boys my father liked before she dated boys she liked. By 17, she had made herself into exactly the kind of daughter Richard Bennett wanted to have, and the reward was real. She got the car, the trip to Europe after graduation, the wedding my father would eventually pay $200,000 for without blinking. I never quite figured out the trick. Not because I didn't try, I tried for years, but because I was built differently than Vanessa, more like our mother's side of the family, quieter, more observant, less interested in performing a version of myself for an audience. I got good grades because I liked learning, not because grades were currency. I played soccer because I liked running until my lungs burned, not because it would look good on an application. My father found this baffling, and I think, a little bit insulting, as though my refusal to perform for him was itself a kind of rebellion, even when I didn't intend it as one. Tyler, 4 years younger, had it hardest in a different way. He was the only boy, which in my father's mind meant he was the heir, not to money exactly, but to the company, to the name, to the whole enterprise of being Richard Bennett's successor. The pressure on Tyler was different from the pressure on Vanessa and me. Ours was about performance. His was about identity. From the time he was 10 years old, my father talked about, when Tyler takes over the company, the way other fathers might talk about a son's future wedding as an inevitability, not a possibility. Nobody ever asked Tyler if he wanted it. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was maybe 11, Vanessa 14, Tyler 7. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Eleanor Whitfield, a sharp, elegant woman who had grown up with real money in Charleston and married down, by her own family's estimation, when she chose my grandfather, a mill supervisor with better instincts than pedigree, was visiting from her house outside Charleston. She watched my father correct Tyler's handshake 3 times before letting him greet the guests. She watched Vanessa recite her class rank unprompted, the way you'd recite a fact you'd been told to have ready. She watched me sit quietly in the corner with a book, trying to be invisible, which had become my primary survival strategy by that age. After dinner, when the kitchen had emptied out except for the 2 of us doing dishes, my grandmother said something I didn't understand until I was almost 30. She said, "Your father built a very impressive house, Maya. I just hope one day you all realize it was never built for you to live in comfortably. It was built for people to look at." I didn't understand what she meant then. I filed it away the way children file away things adults say that sound important but don't yet make sense, the way you keep a key without knowing which door it opens. My grandmother died when I was 26, and it would be 7 more years before I found that door. Growing up sideways. By the time I reached high school, the roles in our family had calcified into something like furniture. Heavy, familiar, arranged so long ago that nobody remembered choosing the layout. Vanessa was the golden one, the proof of concept, the daughter my father could point to at the country club and say, without irony, "That's a Bennett." Tyler was the future, the name carrier, coddled and pressured in equal measure. Praised for potential, he hadn't yet demonstrated and quietly terrified of disappointing a man who had already decided who he was going to become. And I want to be precise about this, because it took me a long time to find the right word. I was tolerated. Not disliked. Not mistreated in any way you could point to and call abuse, not by the standards either of my parents would have recognized. Just tolerated, the way you tolerate a houseplant that doesn't need much and doesn't do much, either. My mother loved me. I want to say that clearly because this isn't a story where anyone is a monster, and my mother was never that. But my mother's love came filtered through 30 years of learning not to contradict my father, and by the time I was a teenager, her love had a particular shape to it. Quiet, sideways, delivered in small gestures rather than open declarations. She'd leave a favorite snack in my room after a hard day. She'd sit with me while I cried about something my father had said, never quite agreeing that he'd been wrong, but never quite defending him either, just present, a warm and slightly helpless kind of presence. I understood even then that she was doing the best she could inside a marriage that had taught her silence was the price of peace. I got my first real glimpse of how money worked in our family when I was 16. Vanessa, 19 and a sophomore at UNC, called home in a panic because she'd wrecked her car. A car my father had bought her the year before, a silver Audi she'd wanted because a girl in her sorority had one. My father drove to Chapel Hill himself, on a Tuesday, missing a client meeting to do it, and came back having not only replaced the car but upgraded it, a newer model. So she wouldn't feel embarrassed driving something that had been in an accident, he said. I remember sitting at the dinner table that week doing math in my head, the kind of math a 16-year-old shouldn't have to do about her own family. The car had cost, I later learned, just under $50,000. I was saving, at the time, for a summer trip with my school's Model UN team, 400 and change, which I'd raised through a car wash and 3 months of babysitting. When I asked my father if he could help with the remaining $150, he told me it would be good for my character to earn it myself. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, and because this story only works if you understand that my father was not a cartoon. He believed, sincerely, that Vanessa's situation and mine were different, that a car accident was an emergency and a school trip was a want, that helping her was parenting and helping me would have been spoiling. I don't think he sat down and consciously decided to love his daughters unequally. I think, if you'd asked him under oath, he would have denied it entirely and believed his own denial. But belief doesn't change arithmetic, and by the time I turned 18, the arithmetic of my childhood told a very consistent story, one my father never once had to say out loud because his checkbook said it for him. Tyler's story was different, but not better. When Tyler was 15, he told my father over dinner that he was thinking about studying environmental science, that he liked the outdoors, that he'd been reading about sustainable urban planning and thought it sounded interesting. I remember the silence that followed. I remember my father setting down his fork very deliberately and saying, "Tyler, you're going to run a real estate company. You don't need environmental science. You need a business degree and about 10 years learning the ropes under me." Tyler was 15. He nodded. He never mentioned environmental science again. Not once, not even in college, where he dutifully majored in business administration and interned every summer at Bennett Development Group, doing filing and site visits, and increasingly, tasks that had less to do with learning the business and more to do with being useful to my father in ways that were never quite defined and never quite optional. I left for college at 18 with a partial academic scholarship to Wake Forest and a determination, which I didn't fully understand at the time, to build a life my father couldn't take credit for or take away. I studied marketing and communications. I worked 2 part-time jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't. I called home once a week, dutifully, and every call followed the same shape. My father would ask about my grades, offer a piece of advice I hadn't requested about positioning myself for the job market, and then the call would end, and I'd feel the particular loneliness of having just spoken to a parent and somehow feeling more alone than before the call started. It was in my sophomore year of college that I met Grant Holloway, who would become my first serious boyfriend, and eventually, my fiancé before Daniel. A fact that matters because it's the downgrade comparison my father made at that dinner table years later. Grant was from Charlotte too, from a family my father knew and approved of. His father was a partner at one of the city's oldest law firms, old money adjacent, country club to the bone. Grant was charming, ambitious, and I understand this now in a way I couldn't then, almost exactly the kind of man my father would have chosen for me if he'd been given a form to fill out. When I brought Grant home for the first time, my father's approval was so immediate and so warm that I remember feeling something I hadn't felt from him before. I remember feeling, for the first time in my life, like I had done something right. It would take me 9 more years to understand that I hadn't done anything at all. I had simply, by accident, chosen someone my father could be proud of in front of other people. The pride wasn't about me. It never had been. Grant and I dated for 6 years, through the end of college and into our mid-20s, and got engaged when I was 27. My father threw us an engagement party that cost more than my entire college education. He gave a toast that night about the Bennett Halloway family, merging 2 great Charlotte names, and I remember standing there in a dress my mother had picked out, smiling, feeling like a plaque being unveiled. The engagement lasted 4 months. I called it off in March of the year I turned 28, 3 weeks after I found out, not from Grant, but from a mutual friend at a happy hour who assumed I already knew, that Grant had been seeing someone else for most of the previous year, a paralegal at his father's firm, and that several people in our social circle had known for months and said nothing, because saying something would have meant disrupting a merger everyone had already RSVP'd to. I will tell that story properly later because it matters to what comes after. But I mention it now because of what happened when I told my father I was calling off the engagement. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what Grant had done. His first question, verbatim, was, "Have you told the Hallowitzes yet? We need to handle this carefully. There are people involved." Not people who loved me, people involved. Guests, vendors, relationships my father had cultivated for 20 years that my broken engagement was now threatening to inconvenience. That was the year I turned 28, and it was the year I started, very quietly, without telling anyone, to build a life that didn't run through my father's approval at all. It would be 4 more years before I met Daniel. It would be 6 more years before I found the shoebox in my grandmother's closet, in a house that by then belonged to no one, that would eventually explain everything I hadn't let myself see. But I'm still getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Daniel. Someone who asked questions first. I met Daniel Reyes on a Tuesday in September, 4 years ago, at a fundraiser for a legal aid nonprofit that one of my coworkers had dragged me to because she needed a +1 and I needed at the time to be dragged anywhere. I was 30. I had spent the 2 years since Grant mostly alone, not out of heartbreak. The heartbreak had passed faster than I expected, but out of something more like caution, a reluctance to hand my life over to someone else's narrative again. Daniel was standing near the bar, not working the room the way most people at these events do, just talking to one person at a time like the conversation actually mattered to him. He was 33 then, already a name partner at a firm he'd co-founded 3 years earlier with a woman named Olivia Whitmore, a firm that specialized in construction, defect litigation, and real estate disputes. Unglamorous, detail-heavy work that Daniel talked about, when I asked, with a kind of quiet intensity that surprised me. He told me about a case where a family had bought a house with a foundation that had been improperly poured, and the builder had tried to bury the paperwork proving they knew about it before the sale closed. Daniel had spent 4 months tracking down a subcontractor's old emails to prove it. People think construction law is boring, he said, but it's mostly just, did someone tell the truth, or did they hide something because the truth was inconvenient? That's not boring. That's basically every important story there is. I didn't know it yet, but he had just described, almost exactly, the shape of the story I would eventually live. What I noticed about Daniel that first night, and what I kept noticing over the months that followed as we started seeing each other, was that he asked questions and then actually waited for the answers. It sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing, not if you grew up the way I grew up, in a house where questions were usually rhetorical setups for someone else's opinion. Daniel would ask me what I thought about something, a work problem, a family dynamic, a restaurant, and then he would sit there, unhurried, genuinely curious, as though my answer were data he needed rather than a formality he was getting through before saying what he actually thought. He grew up, as I mentioned, in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gastonia with his mother, Rosa, who cleaned offices downtown at night for 11 years while going through paralegal certification during the day, determined that her son would have a life with more room in it than the one she'd had. Daniel's father had left when Daniel was 6 and reappeared periodically over the years with promises that dissolved faster than they arrived. Daniel didn't talk about him much, And when he did, it was without bitterness, more like describing weather that had passed. Rosa worked 2 jobs through most of Daniel's childhood and still made it to every school event she could, sometimes falling asleep in the back row of the auditorium because she'd come straight from a night shift. Daniel got into UNC Chapel Hill on a combination of scholarships and loans he was still paying off when I met him, went to Wake Forest Law, the same city as me, though our paths hadn't crossed then, and turned down 2 offers from large corporate firms with 6-figure signing bonuses to instead work at a small litigation boutique for 3 years, learning the unglamorous mechanics of construction and property law, before he and Olivia Whitmore, a former colleague, pooled their savings and opened their own firm in a walk-up office space above a dry cleaner on East Boulevard. By the time I met him, Reyes and Whitmore had grown to 9 attorneys and a reputation within the narrow world of Charlotte real estate litigation, as the firm you called when a deal had gone wrong and somebody needed to prove exactly how and why. They weren't flashy. They didn't have a name on a building downtown. But they won, consistently, in a specific and unglamorous field where winning required an almost obsessive tolerance for paperwork, timelines, and the patient reconstruction of who knew what and when. I fell in love with Daniel slowly, which was itself new for me. Everything with Grant had felt fast and inevitable, propelled by the momentum of 2 families who already approved of the match before Grant, and I had even figured out if we liked each other beyond the obvious. With Daniel, there was no momentum except the kind we built ourselves, 1 dinner, 1 weekend, 1 hard conversation at a time. He met my mother after 8 months and was warm and easy with her in a way that visibly confused her, because she wasn't used to men who didn't need managing. He didn't meet my father for over a year, mostly because I kept finding reasons to delay it, some instinct in me protecting something fragile and new from something I already suspected would try to categorize it, price it, and find it wanting. When Daniel finally did meet my father, at a Sunday dinner I'd put off for months, my father was polite in the specific, chilly way he reserved for people he hadn't yet decided were worth his warmth. He asked Daniel what firm he was with. When Daniel said Reyes and Whitmore, my father's eyebrows moved almost imperceptibly, the particular flicker of a man running a mental Rolodex and not finding the name filed under firms that matter. He asked what kind of law Daniel practiced. When Daniel said construction and real estate litigation, my father made a comment, light, almost a joke, about how, that's a lot of paperwork for not much glory, isn't it? And moved the conversation along to ask Tyler about a permitting issue at one of the company's job sites. I watched Daniel take that in without flinching, without needing to defend himself, without performing anything at all. Later, in the car, I apologized for my father, and Daniel just shrugged and said, "He doesn't know me yet." People who don't know things say things that don't matter. I remember thinking, driving home that night, that I had spent my entire life needing my father's approval to feel like a fact was true, and here was a man who didn't need it at all, and somehow that made me trust every other thing he said even more. We got engaged 2 years after we met, on a Saturday in June, at the small lake house Daniel's firm partner Olivia owned outside Lake Norman, where we'd gone for a long weekend that I only later learned Daniel had spent 3 weeks planning down to the exact dock he wanted to propose from, because he'd noticed, on an earlier trip, that I liked to sit there in the evenings and watch the water. When I said yes, he laughed, a real laugh, surprised at himself, like some part of him hadn't quite believed I would, and I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Nobody had told me. I'd had to find out on my own at 32, 4 years after I'd stopped expecting to. I called my mother first. She cried happy tears and asked when she could meet him properly, as though the 18 months of dinners hadn't counted. I called my father second, mostly out of the obligation of order rather than eagerness, and he said, "Congratulations, sweetheart," in a tone that was perfectly correct and completely unreadable, and then asked when we were planning to have the families meet for a proper celebration, so everyone can toast it right. The proper celebration was the dinner at Foglia. The toast was the one where he called Daniel a downgrade. I want to tell you what happened after he said it, because it's not the part people expect. After the toast, here is what didn't happen at Foglia. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up. I didn't say anything back to my father in front of the table. in front of my mother's carefully applied composure, in front of Vanessa's husband Preston, who I noticed did not laugh but also did not stop eating, in front of Daniel, who set down his fork with a kind of careful stillness I would come to recognize over the following year as his particular way of registering something without reacting to it. What I did was excuse myself to the restroom. I stood in front of the mirror for maybe 90 seconds, running cold water over my wrists, a trick a former therapist had taught me years earlier for moments when my body wanted to do something my mind knew wouldn't help. Then I went back to the table and finished my dinner, because leaving early would have made it a story about me being dramatic rather than a story about what my father had actually said. And I had learned a long time ago that in my family, whoever reacted first usually got blamed for the reaction, regardless of what had provoked it. Daniel didn't say anything at the table either. He is, I would learn over the following months, a man who almost never argues in the room where the argument started. He waited until we were in the car, and even then he didn't lead with anger. He asked, "Are you okay?" The same question, the same patience, the same waiting for my actual answer instead of assuming he already knew it. I told him I was fine. He looked at me for a second too long to fully believe it, but he didn't push. What he said instead was, "I'm not upset for me for what it's worth. I don't need your father to think I'm a good match. I know I am. I'm upset because I watched you go somewhere else in your head for about 10 seconds, somewhere you go when you're protecting yourself, and I've seen you go there before, and I don't like it." I hadn't told him, in so many words, about the 90 seconds in the bathroom, the cold water trick, the years of learning to absorb my father's comments like a body absorbs weather. But he'd noticed anyway. That was the thing about Daniel that undid me a little more every month we were together. He paid attention not to catch me in something, the way my father paid attention, but because he actually wanted to understand the terrain of who I was. My mother called the next morning, before I'd even had coffee. "I hope you're not upset about last night," she said, which was, I'd learned over 3 decades, my mother's version of an apology on my father's behalf, an apology that never actually named what had happened, just gestured toward its aftermath and asked me to manage my own feelings about it quietly. "Your father didn't mean anything by it. You know how he gets when he's had wine. He actually likes Daniel, I could tell. He called him a downgrade, Mom, in front of the whole table. He was talking about, I think he meant financially, is all comparing to Grant's family, and I know that sounds bad, but you know your father, he just says things. He compared my fiancé's worth to another man's family bank account, out loud, at my engagement dinner." There was a pause. My mother has a particular kind of silence she deploys when she's caught between defending my father and admitting he was wrong, a silence I'd learned to recognize as her working out which cost less. "I'll talk to him," she said finally, which we both knew meant nothing would change, but which was, in the economy of my family, the most anyone was going to offer. Vanessa texted me 2 days later. "Dad can be a lot, but he means well, you know that. Preston thought Daniel seemed nice." Followed 4 minutes later by a separate text, "Are we still doing brunch Sunday? I need to talk to you about something anyway." I want to pause here and introduce Vanessa properly, because she is not the villain of this story, even though for a long time I needed her to be one to make sense of my own anger. My sister Vanessa Bennett Cole was 36 that year, married for 8 years to Dr. Preston Cole, a 38-year-old interventional cardiologist at a hospital system downtown. Vanessa had a marketing consulting business she ran mostly for the appearance of having a career. She took on 2 or 3 clients a year, always friends of friends, always projects that photographed well for her social media, which had, over the years, become less a hobby and more a kind of second occupation, curating a version of her life that was polished enough to satisfy an audience that included, always, at the center of it, my father. Vanessa was smart, smarter than she let herself appear, I sometimes thought, and generous in specific, visible ways. She organized the family's holiday gatherings, remembered everyone's birthdays with genuine thoughtfulness, showed up when people were sick. She was also, and I say this with more compassion now than I had at the time, a woman who had built her entire sense of self around being the daughter my father was proud of, and who had never had the space to ask herself what she actually wanted, because wanting things outside my father's approval had never once been modeled for her as safe. Preston, her husband, was harder for me to read, and remains so even now. He was successful in the specific, credentialed way my father respected, a cardiologist with a corner office and a reputation in the hospital system. A man who spoke in the calm, faintly condescending register of someone used to being the smartest person in most rooms. He was polite to me, always, in the particular way that made me suspicious of politeness for years afterward, attentive when my father was watching, distracted when he wasn't. I didn't dislike him, exactly. I just never fully trusted the version of himself he presented at family functions, and it would be almost a year before I understood exactly why. Sunday brunch, 4 days after the engagement dinner, was at Vanessa and Preston's house in the Foxcroft neighborhood, a 5-bedroom colonial they'd bought 2 years earlier that I remembered. At the time, thinking was a significant step up from the townhouse they'd owned before, a step up I hadn't thought much about. Because in my family, houses simply got bigger the way seasons changed. An unremarkable fact of life rather than a data point that meant anything. Vanessa met me at the door with a hug and a mimosa and didn't mention Dad's toast once during the meal, which I understood, by then, as its own kind of message. A family skill, the art of proceeding as though something painful had simply not been said, on the theory that if enough people agreed not to acknowledge it, it would eventually stop being true. It was over coffee, after Preston had excused himself to take a work call, that Vanessa brought up what she'd actually wanted to talk about. "So, this is kind of awkward," she said, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer, a habit she had when she was building up to something. "Dad mentioned he's setting up some kind of trust restructuring thing for the estate planning, and he wants all of us to sign some paperwork at some point. Nothing major," he said, "just updating some old documents from when Grandma Aliner passed." I remember this moment with unusual clarity, because it's one of maybe 3 or 4 points in this story where, looking back, I can see exactly where a different question, asked at exactly this moment, might have changed everything that came after. Instead, distracted by a hangover from the emotional weight of the dinner 4 days earlier, tired, wanting simply to enjoy a quiet brunch with my sister without another complicated conversation, I said, "Sure, whatever, just send it over whenever," and let the moment pass. I would not understand, for another 11 months, what that paperwork actually was, or what it would eventually cost me to have signed it without reading it carefully. That's not a criticism I make of myself lightly, even now. It's simply the truth, and the truth, I've come to believe, is worth more than the version of the story where I'm smarter than I actually was.